The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 3, continued, Cassette 8, Side 2. What should have aroused more astonishment than these drawings was that the text, a triumph of typography but also a scientific revolution, was by a youth of 29. It was a revolution because it ended the reign of Galen in anatomy, revised the whole science in terms of dissection, and so established the physical basis of modern medicine, which begins with this book. Here for the first time were described the true course of the veins and the anatomy of the heart. Here was the epical statement that the most careful dissection showed none of those pores through which Galen had supposed the blood to pass from one ventricle of the heart to the other. So the way was prepared for Servetus, Colombo, and Harvey. Galen was corrected again and again on the liver, the bile ducts, the maxillae, the uterus. Vesalius too made errors, even of observation, and failed to take the great leap from the anatomy of the heart to the circulation of the blood. But here were accurate descriptions of scores of organs, never so well described before, and every part of the body opened to science with a confident and masterly hand. He suffered from the defects of his qualities. The pride that upheld him through years of minute study made him quick to take offense, slow to recognize the achievements of his predecessors and the sensitivity of his rivals. He was so in love with that true Bible, the human body and the nature of man, that he hurt many theological toes. He referred sarcastically to the ecclesiastics who seemed most attracted to his lecture room when the reproductive organs were to be studied and shown. He made many enemies, and though Gessner and Falloppio hailed his work, most of the older professors, including his former teacher Dubois, condemned him as an insolent upstart and sedulously picked flaws in his book. Dubois explained that Galen had not been wrong, but that the human body had changed since Galen's time. So, he thought, the straight thigh bones, which, as everyone saw, were not curved in accordance with Galen's description of them, were the result of the narrow trousers of Renaissance Europeans. In a tempest of disappointment at the attitude of these men, Vesalius burned a huge volume of annotationes, and a paraphrase of the 10 books of Al-Razi's Kitab al-Mansuri, an encyclopedia of medicine. In 1544 he left Italy to become second physician on the staff of Charles V, to whom he had judiciously dedicated the Fabrica. In the same year his father died, leaving him a considerable fortune. He married, and built a handsome home in Brussels. A second edition of the Fabrica was issued in 1555, with augmented and corrected text. It showed that artificial respiration could keep an animal alive despite incision of its chest, and that a stopped heart could sometimes be revived by bellows. Thereafter Vesalius made no contributions to anatomy. He absorbed himself in caring for his imperial and lesser patients, and in the practice and study of surgery. When Charles abdicated, Vesalius became second physician to Philip II. In July 1559, the king sent him to aid Ambroise Pare in an attempt to save the wounded Henry II. Vesalius applied clinical tests that showed no possibility of recovery. Later in that year, he and his family accompanied Philip to Spain. Meanwhile, others advanced anatomy. Giambattista Cano noted the venous valves in 1547. Servetus explained the pulmonary circulation of the blood in 1553. Realdo Colombo made the same discovery in 1558 and proved it by experimenting on the living heart. But another 70 years passed before Harvey's epical description of the course of the blood from heart to lungs, to heart to arteries, to veins, to heart. The Arab physician Ibn al-Nafis had anticipated Servetus in 1285, and the tradition of his doctrine may have carried down into the Spain of Servetus's youth. Vesalius had some adventures left to him. The native physicians at the Spanish court made it a point of honor to disregard his diagnoses. When Don Carlos, Philip's only son, suffered concussion of the brain from a fall in 1562, Vesalius recommended trepanning. The advice was rejected, and the youth neared death. Relics and charms were applied to the wound, and pious people flogged themselves to persuade heaven to effect some miraculous cure, to no avail. Finally, Vesalius insisted on opening the skull. It was done, and a large quantity of pus was drawn off. The prince soon improved, and 8 days after the operation, Philip II attended a solemn procession of thanksgiving to God. 2 years later, Vesalius left Spain, for reasons still in dispute. Ambroise Pare told of an anatomist who brought most of Spain down upon his head by opening the body of a woman supposedly dead from strangulation of the uterus. At a further stroke of the surgeon's knife, said Pare, the woman came suddenly back to life, which struck such admiration and horror into the hearts of all her friends that they accounted the physician, before of good fame and report, as infamous and detestable. Relatives do not always appreciate such unexpected recoveries. Therefore, continued the Huguenot surgeon, he thought there was no better way for him, if he would live safe, than to forsake the country. Hubert Languet, another Huguenot, told a similar story circa 1579, named the physician as Vesalius, and claimed that Vesalius, by dissecting a living person, had become liable to the Inquisition, which he escaped by promising to make a penitential pilgrimage to Palestine. No contemporary source mentions the incident, and Catholic historians reject it as a fable. Perhaps Vesalius was just tired of Spain. He returned to Italy, sailed from Venice in April 1564, and apparently reached Jerusalem. On the way back, he suffered shipwreck and died of exposure, far from any friend, on the island of Zante off the west coast of Greece, on October 15, 1564. He was 50 years old. In that same year, Michelangelo died, and Shakespeare was born. The splendor that had shone for a century in Italy was passing to the north. 6. The rise of surgery. Despite the advances of anatomy, the science and art of medicine were still in leading strings to Greek and Arabic authorities. The evidence of the senses hardly availed against the word of Galen or Avicenna. Even Vesalius, when his dissections disproved Galen, said, "I could hardly believe my eyes." Editions or translations of Galen or Hippocrates, while spreading old knowledge, discouraged new experiments, very much as the efforts of Petrarch and Ronsard to write Virgilian epics diverted and injured their natural genius. When Linacre founded what was later named the Royal College of Physicians in 1518, its principal texts were his translations of Galen. Therapy benefited from new drugs brought to Europe: cinchona, ipecacuanha, and rhubarb from America, ginger and benzoin from Sumatra, cloves from the Moluccas, aloes from Cochin China, camphor and cinnabar from China, and the development widened the use of native plants. Valerius Cordus compiled the first German pharmacopoeia in 1546. The treatment of syphilis with infusions of gaiac wood from the West Indies was so popular that the Fuggers made another fortune by securing from their debtor, Charles V, a monopoly on its sale in his realms. The poverty and uncleanliness of the masses kept diseases always ahead of cures. Open heaps of refuse or dung poisoned the air, and sometimes littered the streets. Paris had a system of sewers, which Henry II proposed to empty into the Seine. The municipal authorities dissuaded him by explaining that the river was the sole drinking water that half the people had. Sewer commissions were set up in England in 1532, but as late as 1844 there were only 2 English towns where refuse was removed at public expense from the slums. Epidemics were less virulent than in the Middle Ages, but they sufficed, along with high puerperal and infantile mortality, to keep the population almost stationary. Plagues swept through Germany and France repeatedly between 1500 and 1568. Typhus fever spread in England in 1422, 1577, and 1586 through the migrations of lice. The sweating sickness, probably a form of influenza, ravaged England in 1528, 1529, 1551, 1578, Germany in 1543 to 45, France in 1550 to 51. Hamburg and Aachen, we are told, each lost 1,000 souls to it within a few days. Influenza was ascribed to celestial influences, hence its name. The bubonic plague reappeared in Germany in 1562, taking 9,000 of the 40,000 inhabitants of Nuremberg, though we may suspect all plague statistics as exaggerations. Brighter sides of the picture are the fading out of leprosy and such mental disorders as St. Vitus's dance. Medical practice progressed more slowly than medical knowledge. Quacks still abounded. Despite some restrictive laws, it was easy to practice medicine without a degree. Most babies were eased into the world by midwives. Specialism had hardly begun. Dentistry was not separated from medicine or surgery. Barber surgeons extracted teeth and replaced them with ivory substitutes. Nearly all physicians, Vesalius was one of the exceptions, left surgery to barber surgeons, who, however, must not be thought of as barbers. Many of them were men of training and skill. Ambroise Pare began as a barber's apprentice and rose to be surgeon to kings. Born in 1517 at Bourg-Gerson in Maine, he made his way to Paris and set up his barber's stall in the Place Saint-Michel. During the War of 1536 he served as a regimental surgeon. In treating soldiers he accepted the prevailing theory that gunshot wounds were poisonous, and, like Vesalius, he followed the current practice of cauterizing them with boiling elder oil, which turned pain into agony. One night the oil ran out, and for lack of it, Pare dressed the wounds with a salve of egg yolk, attar of roses, and turpentine. On the morrow he wrote, "Last night I could hardly sleep for continually thinking about the wounded men whose hurts I had not been able to cauterize. I expected to find them all dead the next morning. With this in view I rose early to visit them. Greatly to my surprise I found that those whom I had treated with the salve had very little pain in their wounds, no inflammation, and had passed a comfortable night. The others, whose wounds had been treated with boiling elder oil, were in high fever, while their wounds were inflamed and acutely painful. I determined, therefore, that I would no longer cauterize the unfortunate in so cruel a manner." Pare had little education, and it was not till 1545 that he published his little manual, now a medical classic, on the treatment of wounds, Méthode du traiter les plaies. In the War of 1552 he proved that ligature of the artery was preferable to cauterization to check bleeding and amputations. Captured by the enemy, he earned his release by successful operations. On returning to Paris, he was appointed head surgeon at the Collège Saint-Côme, to the horror of the Sorbonne, where a professor innocent of Latin seemed a biological monstrosity. Nevertheless, he became surgeon to Henry II, then to Francis II, then to Charles IX, and though a professed Huguenot, he was spared by royal order in the massacre of St. Bartholomew. His De Livre de Chirurgie of 1573 added little to the theory, much to the practice of surgery. He invented new instruments, introduced artificial limbs, popularized the use of the truss in hernia, improved podalic version in childbirth, made the first exarticulation of the elbow joint, described monoxide poisoning, and indicated flies as carriers of disease. Famous in the annals of medicine is his demur to the congratulations on his success in a difficult case. "Je le pensais, Dieu le guérit." I treated him, God cured him. He died in 1590, age 73. He had considerably improved the status and competence of surgeons, and had given France, in surgery, that lead which it was to retain for several centuries. 7. Paracelsus and the Doctors. In every generation, men arise who, resenting the cautious conservatism of the medical profession, lay claim to remarkable cures by heterodox means, denounce the profession as cruelly laggard, perform wonders for a time, and then lose themselves in a mist of desperate extravagance and isolation. It is good that such gadflies should appear now and then to keep medical thought on its toes, and good that medicine should check hasty innovations in dealing with human life. Here, as in politics and philosophy, radical youth and conservative age unwillingly cooperate in that balance of variation and heredity which is nature's technique of development. Philippus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim called himself Aurelius as signifying the carrot of his brilliance, and Paracelsus probably as a Latinization of Hohenheim. His father, Wilhelm Bombast von Hohenheim, was the illegitimate son of a hot-tempered Swabian noble. Left to shift for himself, Wilhelm practiced medicine among poor villagers near Einsiedeln in Switzerland, and married Elsa Oxner, an innkeeper's daughter and nurse's aide, who soon afterward developed a manic-depressive condition. This ambivalent ancestry may have inclined Philip to instability, and to a resentful sense of capacities inadequately nurtured by his environment. Born in 1493, he grew up amid his father's patients, and perhaps in undue familiarity with inns, whose unbuttoned life remained always to his taste. A dubious story alleges that the boy was emasculated by a wild boar or by drunken soldiers. No woman is known to have figured in his adult life. When he was 9, his mother drowned herself. Probably for that reason, father and son moved to Villach in Tyrol. There, says tradition, Wilhelm taught in a school of mines and dabbled in alchemy. Certainly there were mines nearby and a smelter, and it is likely that Philip learned there some of the chemistry with which he was to revolutionize therapy. At the age of 14, he went off to study at Heidelberg. The restlessness of his nature showed now in his quick passage from one university to another: Freiburg, Ingolstadt, Cologne, Tübingen, Vienna, Erfurt, Finally, from 1513 to 1515, Ferrara, though such scholastic peregrination was frequent in the Middle Ages. In 1515, without having won a degree, Philip, now Paracelsus, took service as a barber surgeon in the army of Charles I of Spain. The campaign over, he resumed his footloose life. If we may believe him, he practiced medicine in Granada, Lisbon, England, Denmark, Prussia, Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, and other lands. He was in Salzburg during the Peasants' War of 1525, treated their wounds, and sympathized with their aims. He had a socialist spell. He denounced money, interest, merchants, and advocated communism in land and trade, and equal remuneration for all. In his first book, Archidoxa, The Arch Wisdom, 1524, he rejected theology and lauded scientific experiment. Arrested after the failure of the Peasants' Revolt, he was saved from the gallows by evidence that he had never taken up arms, but he was banished from Salzburg and left in haste. In 1527 he was at Strasbourg, practicing surgery and lecturing to barber surgeons. His doctrine was a confusion of sense and nonsense, magic and medicine, though God knows how the future will describe our current certainties. He rejected astrology, then accepted it. He would not give an enema when the moon was in the wrong phase. He laughed at the divining rod, but claimed to have transmuted metals into gold. Animated, like the young Agrippa, by a thirst for knowledge, he sought anxiously the philosopher's stone, that is, some universal formula that would explain the universe. He wrote credulously about gnomes, asbestos salamanders, and signatures, the treatment of diseased organs with drugs resembling them in color or form. He was not above using magical incantations and amulets as cures, perhaps as suggestive medicine. But this same man, dripping with the delusions of his time, boldly advanced the application of chemistry to medicine. Sometimes he spoke like a materialist. Man derives from matter, and matter is the whole universe. Man is to the universe as microcosm to macrocosm. Both are composed of the same elements, basically salts, sulfur, and mercury, and the apparently lifeless metals and minerals are instinct with life. Chemotherapy is the use of the macrocosm to cure the microcosm. Man is, in body, a chemical compound. Sickness is a disharmony not of Galen's humors, but of the chemical constituents of the body. Here was the first modern theory of metabolism. By and large, the therapy of the age depended for its drugs on the plant and animal world. Paracelsus, deep in alchemy, stressed the curative possibilities of inorganic materials. He made mercury, lead, sulfur, iron, arsenic, copper sulfate, and potassium sulfate parts of the pharmacopoeia. He spread the use of chemical tinctures and extracts. He was the first to make that tincture of opium, which we call laudanum. He encouraged the use of mineral baths and explained their diverse properties and effects. He noted the occupational and geographical factors in disease, studied fibroid phthisis in miners, and first linked cretinism with endemic goiter. He advanced the understanding of epilepsy and related paralysis and speech disturbances to injuries of the head. Whereas gout and arthritis had been generally accepted as natural and incurable accompaniments of increasing age, Paracelsus claimed that they were curable if diagnosed as due to acids formed by food residues too long retained in the colon. All diseases can be traced to a coagulation of undigested matter in the bowels. These acids of intestinal putrefaction he called tartar, because their deposits in joints, muscles, kidneys, and bladder burn like hell, and tartarus is hell. Doctors boast of their knowledge of anatomy, he said, but they fail to see the tartar sticking to their teeth. And the word stuck. He proposed to check the formation of such deposits in the body by a healthy diet, tonics, and improved elimination. He tried to mollify the deposits by using laurel oil and resin compounds, and in extreme cases he advocated surgery to allow the accretions to escape or be removed. He claimed to have cured many cases of gout by these methods, and some physicians in our time believe they have made cures by following Paracelsus's diagnosis. News of cures accomplished by Paracelsus in Strasbourg reached Basel. There the famous printer Froben was suffering acute pain in his right foot. The doctors advised amputation. Froben invited Paracelsus to come to Basel and diagnose the case. Paracelsus came and effected a cure without use of the knife. Erasmus, then living with Froben and many ailments, consulted Paracelsus, who prescribed for him. We do not know with what success. In any case, these famous patients gave the young doctor new fame, and a strange medley of circumstances brought him close to that university professorship which he coveted. At this time, the Protestants were in a majority in the city council of Basel. Over the objections of Erasmus and the Catholic minority, they dismissed Dr. Wönecker, the city physician, on the ground that he had uttered fresh words against the Reformation, and they appointed Paracelsus in his place. The council and Paracelsus assumed that the appointment carried with it the right to teach in the university, but the faculty condemned the appointment and, knowing the weakness of Paracelsus in anatomy, proposed a public examination of his fitness. He evaded the test, began practice as city physician, and gave public lectures in a private hall without university sanction, this in 1527. He gathered students by a characteristic invitation. Theophrastus Bombast of Hohenheim, doctor of both medicines and professor, greetings to the students of medicine. Of all disciplines, medicine alone is recognized as a sacred art. Yet few doctors today practice it with success, and therefore the time has come to bring it back to its former dignity, to cleanse it from the leaven of the barbarians, and to purge their errors. We shall do so not by strictly adhering to the rules of the ancients, but by exclusively studying nature and using the experience which we have gained in long years of practice. Who does not know that most contemporary doctors fail because they slavishly abide by the precepts of Avicenna, Galen, and Hippocrates? This may lead to splendid titles, but does not make a true doctor. What a doctor needs is not eloquence or knowledge of language and of books, but profound knowledge of nature and her works. Thanks to the liberal allowance the gentlemen of Basel have granted for that purpose, I shall explain the textbooks which I have written on surgery and pathology every day for 2 hours as an introduction to my healing methods. I do not compile these from excerpts of Hippocrates or Galen. In ceaseless toil I created them anew upon the foundations of experience, the supreme teacher of all things. If I want to improve anything, I shall not do so by quoting authorities, but by experiment and by reasoning thereupon. If, therefore, dear reader, you should feel the impulse to enter into these divine mysteries, if, within a brief lapse of time, you should want to fathom the depths of medicine, then come to me at Basel. Basel, June 5th, 1527. 30 students registered for the course. At its opening, Paracelsus appeared in the customary professorial robe, but at once he cast it aside and stood forth in the rough garb and sooty leather apron of the alchemist. His lectures on medicine were given in a Latin form prepared by his secretary Operinus, who later printed Vesalius's Fabrica. On surgery he spoke in German. This was a further shock to the orthodox physicians, but hardly so disturbing as when Paracelsus proposed that no pharmacist should act in collusion with any doctor. As if to signalize his scorn of traditional medicine, he merrily threw into a bonfire, lit by students to celebrate St. John's Day, June 24, 1527, a recent medical text, probably the Summa Jacobii. I threw into St. John's fire, he said, the Summa of the books, so that all the misfortunes might go up in the air with the smoke. Thus the realm of medicine has been purged. Men compared the gesture with Luther's burning of a papal bull. Paracelsus's life in Basel was as heterodox as his lectures. The 2 years I passed in his company, said Operinus, he spent in drinking and gluttony day and night. He was a spendthrift, so that sometimes he had not a penny left. Every month he had a new coat made for him and gave away his old one to the first comer, but usually it was so dirty that I never wanted one. Heinrich Bullinger gave a similar picture of Paracelsus as a hard drinker and an extremely dirty, unclean man. But Operinus testified to remarkable cures performed by his master. In curing ulcers he almost did miracles in cases which had been given up by others. The profession disowned him as a degreeless quack, a reckless empiric, incapable of dissection and ignorant of anatomy. He opposed dissection on the ground that the organs could be understood only in their united and normal functioning in the living organism. He returned the scorn of the doctors in the liveliest Billingsgate. He laughed at their barbarous prescriptions, their silk shirts, finger rings, sleek gloves, and haughty gait. He challenged them to come out of the classrooms into the chemical laboratory, to put on aprons, soil their hands with the elements, and bending over furnaces learn the secrets of nature by experiment and the sweat of their brows. He made up for his lack of a degree by taking such titles as Prince of Philosophy and Medicine, Doctor of both Medicines, that is, physician and surgeon, and propagator of philosophy, and he salved the wounds of his vanity with the confidence of his claims. "All shall follow me," he wrote, "and the monarchy of medicine shall be mine. All the universities and all the old writers put together are less talented than my ass." Rejected by others, he took as his motto, "Alterius non sit qui suus esse potest." Let him not belong to another who can be his own. History rebuked his boasts by making his family name Bombast a common noun. Whether through collusion with the university faculty or in a spontaneous revolt of students against a dogmatic teacher, an anonymous Basel wit composed and prominently exposed a lampoon in dog Latin, purporting to be written by Galen himself from Hades against his detractor, whom he called Cacophrastus, dung speaker. It made great fun of Paracelsus's mystical terminology, called him a madman, and suggested that he hang himself. Unable to find the culprit, Paracelsus asked the town council to question the students one by one and to punish the guilty. The council ignored the request. About this time, a canon of the Basel cathedral offered 100 guilders to anyone who would cure him of his disease. Paracelsus cured him in 3 days. The canon paid him 6 guilders, but refused the rest on the ground that the cure had taken so little time. Paracelsus sued him in court and lost. He lost his temper, too, denounced his critics as Bescheißer and Arschkretzer, cheaters and rear-scratchers, and published anonymously a pamphlet branding the clergy and magistrates as corrupt. The council ordered his arrest, but deferred execution of the order till the next morning. During the night, Paracelsus fled, this in 1528. He had been 10 months in Basel. In Nuremberg, he recapitulated his experience at Basel. The city fathers gave him charge of a prison hospital. He worked impressive cures, but he inveighed against the jealous medicos of the town for their dishonesty, their opulence, and the size of their wives. Noting that the majority of the council was Protestant, he defended Catholicism. The Fuggers, who sold guaiac, were alarmed by his contention that this holy wood was useless in the treatment of syphilis. In 1530, he persuaded an obscure printer to publish 3 chapters on the French disease, which so berated the doctors that a storm of opposition forced him to resume his wandering. He wished to publish a larger work on the same subject, but the city council forbade its printing. Paracelsus, in a letter to the council, pleaded with ineffective eloquence for the freedom of the press. The book was never printed in his lifetime. It contained the best clinical description of syphilis yet written, and advised internal doses, rather than external applications, of mercury. Syphilis became a battleground of vegetable versus chemical therapy. Moving to Saint-Gall, Paracelsus lived for half a year in the house of a patient. There and later he wrote his Opus Paramirum, the very wonderful work, his Paragranum, Against the Grain, and Die große Wundarznei, the Great Surgery, all in rough German. They are heaps of crude ore, with here and there a gem. In 1534 he relapsed into magic and composed Philosophia Sagax, a compendium of the occult. When his patient in Saint-Gall died, he took to the road again, passing from place to place in Germany, sometimes begging his bread. In his youth he had uttered some religious heresies, that baptism has only symbolic significance, that the sacraments are good for children and fools, but useless for men of intelligence, and that prayers to the saints are a waste of time. Now, in 1532, poor and defeated, he experienced religious conversion. He fasted, gave his remaining goods to the poor, wrote essays of devotion, and consoled himself with hopes of paradise. In 1540, the Bishop of Salzburg offered him asylum, and the man who had encouraged revolution there 15 years before accepted gratefully. He made his will, bequeathing his few coins to relatives, his instruments to the barber surgeons of the city, and on September 24, 1541, he yielded his body to the earth. He was a man overcome by his own genius, rich in varied experience and brilliant perceptions, but too little schooled to separate science from magic, too undisciplined to control his fire, too angrily hostile to infuse his influence into his time. Perhaps his career, along with Agrippa's, helped to swell the legend of Faust. Until a century ago, people suffering an epidemic in Austria made a pilgrimage to his grave in Salzburg, hoping to be healed by the magic of his spirit or his bones. 8. The Skeptics. The 16th century was a poor time for philosophy. Theology absorbed the active thinkers, and faith, ruling every roost, kept reason in its train. Luther rejected reason as inclining to atheism, but cases of atheism were rare. A Dutch priest was burned at The Hague in 1512 for denying creation, immortality, and the divinity of Christ, but he was not clearly an atheist. "This year," wrote an English chronicler under 1539, "there died in the University of Paris a great doctor, which said there was no God, and had been of that opinion since he was 20 years old, and was above 80 years old when he died, and all that time he kept that error secret." Guillaume Postel, in 1552, published a book Contra Atheos, but the word atheist was seldom distinguished from deist, pantheist, or skeptic. Skeptics were numerous enough to win a blow from Luther. "For the blind children of the world," he is reported to have said, "the articles of faith are too high, that 3 persons are only one God, that the true Son of God was made man, that in Christ there are 2 natures, divine and human, etc. All this offends them as fiction and fable." And some, he added, doubted whether God had created men whose damnation he had foreseen. In France there were some skeptics of immortality. Bonaventure Desperriers, in his Symbolum Mundi of 1537, ridiculed miracles, the contradictions of the Bible, and the persecution of heretics. His book was condemned by Calvin and the Sorbonne, and was burned by the official hangman. Marguerite had to banish him from her court at Nérac, but she sent him money to keep him alive at Lyon. In 1544 he killed himself, leaving his manuscripts to Marguerite, prop and safeguard of all goodness. The spirit of doubt appeared in politics in the form of attacks on the divine right and inviolability of kings. And here the skeptics were usually Protestant thinkers uncomfortable under Catholic rulers, or Catholic thinkers smarting under the triumph of the state. Bishop John Ponnet, resenting Mary Tudor, published in 1558 a short treatise of politic power, which argued that the manifold and continual examples that have been from time to time of the deposing of kings and killing of tyrants do most certainly confirm it to be most true, just and consonant to God's judgment. Kings, princes, and governors have their authority of the people, and men may recover their proxies when it pleaseth them. John Major, a Scottish professor who helped to form the mind of John Knox, argued likewise that since all secular authority derives from the will of the community, a bad king may be deposed and executed, but only by due process of law. The most interesting opponent of royal absolutism was a young Catholic who achieved a modest immortality by dying in Montaigne's arms. Etienne de la Boétie, said the incomparable essayist, was the greatest man, to my mind, of our age. Son of a high official in Périgord, Etienne studied law at Orléans, and before the prescribed age was admitted as a councillor to the Parlement of Bordeaux. About 1549, as a youth of 19, inspired with republican ideas by his study of Greek and Roman literature, he wrote, he never published, a passionate attack on absolutism. He called it Discours sur la servitude volontaire. But as it denounced the dictatorship of one over many, it came to be called contre un, against one. Hear its flaming appeal. What a shame and disgrace it is when countless men obey a tyrant willingly, even slavishly, a tyrant who leaves them no rights over property, parents, wife, or child, not even over their own lives. What kind of a man is such a tyrant? He is no Hercules, no Samson. Often he is a pygmy, often the most effeminate coward among the whole people. Not his own strength makes him powerful, him who is often the slave of the vilest whores. What miserable creatures are his subjects! If 2, 3, or 4 do not revolt against one, there is an understandable lack of courage. But when hundreds and thousands do not throw off the shackles of an individual, what remains there of individual will and human dignity? To free oneself, it is not necessary to use force against a tyrant. He falls as soon as the country is tired of him. The people who are being degraded and enslaved need but deny him any right. To be free only calls for the earnest will to shake off the yoke. Be firmly resolved no longer to be slaves, and you are free. Deny the tyrant your help, and like a colossus whose pedestal is pulled away, he will collapse and break to pieces. La Boétie proceeded to formulate Rousseau and Tom Paine. Man naturally longs for liberty. Inequalities of fortune are fortuitous, and lay upon the fortunate the obligation to serve their fellow men. All men are brothers, made from the same mold by the same God. Strange to say, it was the reading of this radical pronouncement that attracted the normally cool and cautious Montaigne to La Boétie, and led, in 1557, to one of the most famous friendships in history. Montaigne was then 24, Etienne was 27. Perhaps Montaigne was then young enough to harbor radical sentiments. Their friendship was soon ended by La Boétie's death at the age of 32 in 1563. Montaigne described the final days as if remembering Plato's account of the death of Socrates. He so keenly felt the loss of the warm-hearted youth that 17 years later he spoke of it with deeper feeling than of anything else in his experience. He had not favored the printing of the Discours, and mourned when a Genevese pastor published it in 1576. He ascribed the composition to the generous spirit of youth, and predated it to the age of 16. It was almost the voice of the French Revolution. 9. Ramos and the Philosophers. Quite as romantic was the life, and more violent the death, of Petrus Ramos, the heir de la Ramée, who undertook to overthrow the tyranny of Aristotle. Here was a one-man rule that had lasted 3 centuries and more, over not one nation only, but many, and over not the body but the mind, almost over the soul. For had not the pagan thinker been made an official philosopher of the Church? The humanists of the Renaissance had thought to displace him with Plato, but the Reformation, or fear of it, was strangling humanism, and in Protestant Germany as well as Catholic France, Aristotelian scholasticism was still in the saddle when Luther, who had cursed it, died in 1546. To depose the Stagirite from his throne seemed to intellectual youth the most legitimate form of tyrannicide. Applying for the master's degree at the University of Paris in 1536, Ramos, aged 21, took as his thesis, to be defended through a whole day against faculty and all challengers, the unequivocal proposition, "Whatever was said by Aristotle is false." Ramos's career was an ode to education. Born near Calvin's Noyon, in Picardy, he twice tried to walk to Paris, hungry for its colleges. Twice he failed and returned defeated to his village. In 1528, aged 12, he succeeded by attaching himself as servant to a rich student matriculating in the Collège de Navarre, the same that Villon had robbed. Serving by day, studying by night, Pierre made his way for 8 years through the heavy curriculum in the Faculty of Arts. He almost lost his eyesight in the process, but he found Plato. When I came to Paris, I fell among the subtleties of the sophists, and they taught me the liberal arts through questions and disputings, without showing me any other advantage or use. When I had graduated, I decided that these disputes had brought me nothing but loss of time. Dismayed by this thought, led by some good angel, I chanced on Xenophon and then on Plato, and learned to know the Socratic philosophy. How many of us have made that same exhilarating discovery in youth, happy to meet in Plato a philosopher who had wine and poetry in his blood, who heard philosophy in the very air of Athens, caught it on the wing, and sent it down the centuries, still bearing the breath of life, all those voices of Socrates and his pupils still ringing with the lust and ecstasy of debate about the most exciting subjects in the world. What a relief after the prosy pages of Aristotle, after reams of middle-of-the-road and not-so-golden mean. Of course we, and Ramos, were unfair to Aristotle, comparing his compact lecture notes with the popular dialogues of his master. Only white hairs can appreciate the Stagirite. The Aristotle that Ramos knew was chiefly the logician of the Organon, the Aristotle of the schools, barely surviving the ordeal of translation into scholastic Latin, of transmogrification into a good Christian orthodox Thomist. 3 years, said Ramos, he had spent studying Aristotle's logic without ever being shown a single use or application of it in science or in life. It is to the credit of the Paris faculty, as well as to the learning and skill and courage of Ramos, that he was given his master's degree. Perhaps the professors, too, were weary of logic and moderation. But some of them were scandalized, and felt that their stock in trade had been damaged by that day's debate. Enmities began that pursued Ramos to his death. His degree entitled him to teach, and he began at once, at the university, a course of lectures, in which he mingled philosophy with Greek and Latin literature. His classes grew, his earnings mounted, and he was able to reimburse his widowed mother for the savings that she had sacrificed to pay for his graduation fee. After 7 years of preparation, he issued in 1543, the Annus Mirabilis of Copernicus and Vesalius, 2 works that continued his campaign to overthrow the Aristotelian logic. One, Aristotelicae Animadversiones, was a frontal assault, sometimes phrased in impetuous invective. The other, Dialecticae Partitiones, Divisions of Logic, offered a new system to replace the old. It redefined logic as ars discerendi, the art of discourse, and brought logic, literature, and oratory together in a technique of persuasion. The university authorities forgivably saw some dangers in this approach. Moreover, they viewed with suspicion certain propositions in Ramos that smelled of heresy, such as unbelief is the beginning of knowledge, Cartesian doubt before Descartes, or his plea to replace the tomes of the scholastics with more study of the Scriptures. This had a Protestant ring, or his definition of theology as doctrina bene vivendi, which threatened to reduce religion to morality. And there were Ramos's irritating ways, his pride and pugnacity, his violent controversial tone, his dogmatic superiority to dogma. Soon after publication of these books, the rector of the university cited Ramos before the provost of Paris as an enemy of the faith, a disturber of the public peace, a corrupter of youth with dangerous novelties. The trial was held before a royal commission of 5 men, 2 appointed by Ramos, 2 by his accusers, 1 by Francis I. Dissatisfied with the procedure of the trial, Ramos withdrew his appointees. The remaining 3 decided against him in 1544, and a royal mandate forbade him to lecture, or to publish, or to attack Aristotle further. The condemnation notice was placarded throughout the city, and was sent to other universities. Students staged burlesques ridiculing Ramos, and Rabelais made heavenly fun of the fracas. After holding his peace for a while, Ramos opened a course of lectures at the Collège Ave Maria, but he confined himself to rhetoric and mathematics, and the government winked at his disobedience. In 1545 he became assistant rector of the Collège des Prels, and his lecture room was soon crowded. When Henry II succeeded Francis I, he repealed the sentence against Ramos, left him free in both tongue and pen, and a year later appointed him to a chair in the Collège Royal, where he would be exempt from university control. Having reached his pinnacle as now the most famous teacher in Paris, Ramos devoted much time and effort to reforming pedagogical methods. If he stressed rhetoric, which then meant literature, it was not only to revivify philosophy with poetry, but also to infuse a vibrant humanism into courses grown dry and hard with abstractions and scholastic rules. In 5 treatises on grammar, he applied logic to language. He begged French spelling to become phonetic, but it went its reeling way. However, he succeeded in introducing into the French alphabet the letters J and V to replace consonantal I and U. Remembering his own penniless striving for an education, he encouraged the establishment of scholarships for poor students and condemned the heavy fees required for graduation. At the same time, he labored to raise the remuneration of teachers. In 1555 he published Dialectique, the first work on logic in French. This book is continued on Cassette 9, Side 1.